This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the Vietnam War. The historical context. France had colonized Indochina in the late 1800s. Indochina included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In the north, Ho Chi Minh led northern Vietnam and a group called the Viet Minh against the French in the 1920s. During World War II, the Japanese so-called liberated Vietnam from France, but then really used the Vietnamese as their own slaves. Ho Chi Minh acted as an agent for allies during World War II, hoping to gain independence from the war. So Ho Chi Minh actually played as sort of a double agent. For a while he worked for the Japanese, and then he worked for both the Japanese and the United States. He was hoping that when World War II ended, the United States would recognize this and give Vietnam its independence. However, he became disappointed because the Allies just saw him as a communist threat. The French loss. The French regained Indochina after World War II and had a technological advantage over the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh decided to use guerrilla warfare tactics in order to steal French weapons and then surprise them with their own weapons. In 1953, the Vietnamese surrounded the French at a northern French fort called Dien Bien Phu. After this was done, the French decided to hand Vietnam over to the Vietnamese. At a place called Geneva, Switzerland, for the Geneva Accords, the French promised to leave Vietnam and allow for 2 years until a national election could reunite northern Vietnam with southern Vietnam under one government. The Vietnamese would get to choose through an election what type of government this would be. U.S. involvement. The first U.S. involvement goes back to Harry S. Truman. He had sent money for anti-communist troops for the French. Eisenhower eventually sent military advisors for the South Vietnamese government. John F. Kennedy backed a leader called Ngo Diem as the South Vietnamese leader. Diem, who had been educated in America, returned back to South Vietnam as a leader. He was Catholic. When he got back to South Vietnam, he redistributed land, but this redistribution program was really done to benefit his own wealthy friends. He then turned around and began closing Buddhist temples. Eventually, this led to a massive protest by Buddhist monks who walked through the streets of Saigon. And as they walked through these streets, one of these Buddhist monks came out of the group, sat down in what is known as the lotus position, and had gasoline poured on him and was set on fire. This protest was caught on international media. It eventually led to international pressure against Diem and his government. Diem was eventually overthrown by his own military, and the U.S. pulled back any support for him during this coup. The Gulf of Tonkin. Lyndon Johnson claimed in 1964 that 2 U.S. battleships had been attacked by the North Vietnamese in international waters. They were the Sea Turner Joy and the USS Maddox. He was able to get after this the Tonkin Resolution, which increased American military presence to 50,000 troops. He argued the position of the domino theory, that if communism was allowed to spread in one country, it would then begin gaining victories in other countries. In this case, this would mean the collapse of Southeast Asia. The U.S. military strategy. The U.S. feared a situation similar to that of the Korean War, where the Chinese had gotten involved. So the main strategy was not to have American troops get too close to China, but rather to use a strategy in which B-29 bomber airplanes would attack northern Vietnam. This was called Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. also used napalm in order to destroy areas of rainforest where the enemy could hide out. Also, America instituted something known as the Operation Hamlet, in which American troops would go out and build areas for Vietnamese villagers in order to be safe from communist insurgents. U.S. mistakes. However, these strategies assumed many positions that ended up being mistakes. The Vietnam War was actually more of a war for national independence than the spreading of international communism. This meant that many people who were fighting in Vietnam on both sides resented the U.S. involvement. Napalm and Agent Orange, used really to get rid of hiding places for communists, often ended up destroying innocent villagers' homes by accident, creating resentment towards the U.S. In Operation Hamlet, which had a good motivation of trying to protect Vietnamese against possible communist spies, ended up moving people off of their traditional lands. This was seen as an insult to Vietnamese ancestors, causing even more resentment towards the U.S. military. The Tet Offensive. In 1968, General Westmoreland told the American public that the U.S. was winning the war. The North Vietnamese ended up forming a ceasefire with the Americans on the Tet New Year for the Vietnamese. However, the North Vietnamese had no intention of upholding the ceasefire. They broke the ceasefire on the New Year's in Vietnam and invaded all the way down into Saigon. The U.S. and the South Vietnamese, who had been off for this holiday, ended up regrouping and then actually defeating the Viet Minh. But when the U.S. public saw that the North Vietnamese had gotten so far down into the south, all the way down into Saigon, they assumed that the Americans and the South Vietnamese had lied and were actually losing the war. Because of this, they started to turn against the war effort. The election of 1968. Lyndon Johnson lost support and decided not to run for another term in 1968. The Democratic Party at that time broke into three groups. One supported the Vice President Hubert Humphrey, another group supported Eugene McCarthy, and a third, Robert Kennedy. The Republicans all solidified around one candidate, Richard Nixon, who eventually was able to defeat the Democrats because they had split into so many fragments. Richard Nixon won the presidency on the argument that the U.S. would exit the Vietnam War, but would do so without losing honor. Vietnamization of the war. Nixon's policy was Vietnamization, or training the Vietnamese to take over the war effort. He also began a secret bombing campaign of neutral Cambodian border because the North Vietnamese would hide out there. This broke international law and appeared to many people to be a shadow government in which Nixon was lying. However, the reason why Nixon was doing this was because the North Vietnamese were using this neutral area in order to run across the border and hide out in the Cambodian territory. Kent State. Protesters at Kent State University reacted to Nixon's bombing of Cambodia. First, on one night, students burned down a local ROTC building. The governor of the state sent in the National Guard to calm the situation. During the situation in which the crowd started to have a conflict with the National Guard fired into the crowd of students and ended up killing 4 students. A similar incident happened a week later at an all-black college in Jackson, Mississippi. The impact or consequence of this was that most Americans who watched what was happening lost faith in the American government, since young people were being killed during protests. The end of the American involvement. In 1973, the U.S. decided to leave Vietnam as the public turned against the war. In 1975, the United States, under Congress, stopped sending funds to the South Vietnamese government. During that time period, communists invaded South Vietnam. After that, Cambodia and Laos fell to communist groups as well. Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and China then warred over boundary issues. This is important. Keep in mind that after 1975, many people argued that the domino theory was true because Cambodia and Laos also fell to communism. This seemed to suggest the idea that when one country falls, all the others follow suit. However, if that were true, then all of these countries being communist would have allied together against what would have been seen at that time in their countries as the capitalist West. Instead, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and China began arguing with one another over boundary issues, and in some cases, for example, China eventually invaded Vietnam over these boundary issues. In order to answer the problems of the Vietnam War, Congress eventually passed the War Powers Act, which limited the powers of the president to go into an emergency war. The president now had 60 days in which to send out troops for an emergency action. He could then gain 30 more days as an extension, but eventually, after those 90 days, he would have to have Congress's approval in order to continue with any war effort.